Hello, Comparative Politics class. Dr. Maiden here with our final lecture of the semester. This is CPO 4.8, Social Policy, Part 3. We're talking about environmental problems in policy today. But before we get into that, I am all dressed up for you guys. My understanding is, since this is an intro class, I think we maybe have one senior in the class. I won't call her out by name because I don't want to be wrong and embarrass you. But my expectation is none of you are seniors. Just in case any of you are seniors and you're feeling the devastation, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry if you are a senior and you were wanting to walk and you're not going to be able to walk. So I got this out of my closet for you. I did it for my other class too. These are my doctoral robes, right? The fancy ones. This is what I would have worn at your graduation and watched you walk across the stage. Can't do anything about what's going on here. So all I can do is put on my costume. I've got some confetti. Woo! All right. And I can wish you happy graduation. If you're graduating, happy graduation. You've earned it. You made it. I wish you all the best. Okay. So we'll come back together in just a second. I'm going to take this off because it's god awful hot. We'll come back together in just a second and we'll do this final lecture. All right. Stay tuned. Okay, so as I said, this is CPO 4.8. This is the last in the three-part series that we're doing on social policies, and this one is focusing on environmental problems and policy. So we've been talking a lot this last half of the semester here, this last section on market failures. We've talked about it, not only T.A. Trueheart did our lecture on the market and talked about market failures. It keeps coming up. All three of these social policy lectures that we've done have been examples of how state governments can intervene in the case of market failure. So the one that we're doing today, the environment, again, is a case of market failure and governments coming in and intervening and attempting to correct this failure of the market. So the key challenge when it comes to the environment and the market failure it creates is externalities. Externalities. We've already talked about this in two previous lectures now. We've hinted at it. Now we're just diving all the way in, right? Externalities. So the idea with externalities is this sense that no form of pollution, not a single form of pollution, is without cost. There are myriad costs, actually, to pollution in particular. So when you're thinking in terms of the market, failure of the market, one of the big concerns if you are the producer of goods is that products become undervalued. So if you were actually taking into consideration what it really costs you to create something, if you're thinking about all the environmental damage that you cause that you may having to be paid to correct, if you're thinking about all of the things you could be doing to be doing this in a more environmentally sustainable way, right? In reality, the cost of your good is probably much more expensive than you are currently getting. So you also have things like cost to the healthcare system. If you look at Our World in Data is great for this. They have causes of death, leading causes of death worldwide. Pollution is like a top 3 and 4 cause of death, whether it's outside pollution, inside pollution, it's killing people. Imagine the strain on the healthcare system from just something like pollution. People having problems with their lungs, problems with their breathing, etc. Another one then linked to kind of cost to healthcare systems would be cost to the local environment. So if you have a factory that is upriver and it is pumping pollutants into the water, there is a cost to the local environment, both within the direct vicinity of that factory and anything that would be downriver, any village, any development, any farm that's pulling water for irrigation. Everything gets affected by one factory upriver that's polluting the river, okay? So there are drastic costs to the local environment. So when you bring this all together, then you can see this idea that there is absolutely a market failure when it comes to the environment and how we care for or do not care for the environment in our market practices. States are forced then to step in and address it. So why is this? Why do we keep creating this system where we don't really take the environment seriously? We continue to pollute the environment, right? Why do we keep doing this? And the term that you need to know, it's on the slide there, tragedy of the commons. Tragedy of the commons is this idea that no individual has the incentive or ability to preserve things that are held in common. So a good that is like a collective good held in common is a shared good that is free. So there's no collective effort to preserve it. So this type of a good is likely to be overused and or perhaps ultimately destroyed. So the four biggest issues facing the tragedy of the commons and facing the environment are, I've already mentioned the one, pollution as a major issue, deforestation as another. So deforestation, the idea of cutting down trees faster than their renewal rate can allow for. So it's not a problem to cut down trees. In fact, there's a host of research that says it can be healthy for a forest to cull trees from a forest, but deforestation becomes a problem if you take the whole forest or you take too much of the forest and you don't replant enough and wait long enough to let it regrow. Okay, so like I'll pop up this image as an example. This is Central Europe over the course of a couple of hundred years, and you can look at the devastating rate of deforestation. A third major challenge then is what we call desertification. And this is where you take land that was arable, that could be used for grazing or growing crops, and you destroy it to the point where it becomes a desert. So this is a really good picture that shows this. You can kind of see this is two plots of land in Syria divided by a fence. And you can see the desertification on the one side compared to the other side. Both have been drastically depleted, but you can really, really see the difference in that picture, the one versus the other. A main culprit of this is overgrazing. Okay, so whether it's you have too small an area of land, too many animals on it, and you're not able to rotate the animals off of it, because land needs to rest, right? I grew up with horses. We dealt with this. We dealt with having to rotate pastures because the animals will destroy it, and you have to give it time to rest and regrow before you put animals back on it. Another really big challenge is our use of water. So in particular, sucking water up out of the water table for irrigation purposes creates a desert on the top, right? So the water that was below the land gets pulled out through wells, through irrigation to be used for crops, and it destroys the land that was on top. So the fourth one then that we'll talk about is climate change. Climate change, in particular, human-caused greenhouse gas emissions that are leading to global warming, okay? So we'll start with state-level market interventions. State-level market interventions. So we've said the market has this failure, we have this environmental degradation, and the state will intervene and attempt to address it, to correct it, okay? So when we compare the environment, this issue of the environment, to the other two issues we talked about, healthcare, welfare, the environment is interesting because it's called what we refer to as a postmodernist concern. Postmodernist concern. So it's the idea of this has not always been an issue. We have not always been thinking about the challenge of the environment and how to protect it and how to secure it for future generations. Really what we have found is that concern for the environment has increased as environment degradation has become more widespread as wealth has risen. So this has really only been an issue really rooted in the conscience, like an international conscience, since the Industrial Revolution, okay? So the two big issues to come out of the Industrial Revolution was first the idea of conservation of resources. You know, realizing there is only so much coal in the ground. If we dig it all up, that's it. It's gone. There is only so much oil in the ground. When we pump it all out, it will be gone. What will we do when that moment comes? Okay. And then the other one, then, we've already mentioned, damage caused by pollution. So again, it's this idea of, as we have transitioned from agrarian societies into industrial societies, we have noticed the challenge of pollution. We are creating poor air quality. We are creating poor water quality. We are creating new health concerns that we did not have before when we were agrarian societies. So globalization challenges then, if we're thinking not only industrial revolution, but when we're in this very fully fledged era of globalization, is that if we're thinking in terms of models like the world systems theory model, modernization theory, democratization, the spread of global neoliberal capitalism, the whole point of this system is to transition countries from an agrarian model into an industrial model. That will necessarily create more pollution, because we know that that's just what happens. A plus B equals C. So switching from agrarian to industrialization equals more pollution. Another thing that we're noticing here, a challenge with globalization, is what scholars refer to as the race to the bottom. The race to the bottom. And what we're talking about here is the fact that if I have a choice, if I am a US company and I'm manufacturing something that has a pollutant as a byproduct, right? If I am refining something, am I going to do that in my own backyard? If I live in suburban Illinois, am I going to build a factory and pump those pollutants into my own backyard? No. If I have the chance, I'm going to take that factory as far away as I can. So not only can I benefit from previous lectures we've talked about, not only can I benefit from things like paying people lower wages, having lower security, job security, and just health security for my workers, right? But I can also get away with pumping pollutants into the water, and I don't care as much because it's not in my backyard. So the race to the bottom is this idea that all around the world, companies in the global north, in the west, are going to take their terrible polluting manufacturing productions and they're going to move them to the bottom, right? Move them to the poorest countries of the world and exploit them. And so then people in those parts of the world that are not benefiting from the products that are getting created in their country are only feeling the effects of the pollution. All right? So that's a big challenge that globalization has presented to us. Not only globalization, but so much about the economic system and the way we've created it. Global neoliberal capitalism is creating this race to the bottom. And then the last one, and we're gonna talk a couple more slides about this one, is this fact of climate change. Okay, climate change and the very real dangers that it's presenting to our society. All right. So this is from Our World in Data. This is looking at average temperatures and how they're raising over time. Because a lot of people really struggle with the idea of like climate change. Well, the climate is always changing. Yes, the climate is always changing. But what a graph like this is trying to show us is that while we do have normal up and down cycles of temperature, what we have had since around the 1980s is an up and down that just keeps going up and up and up and up and up. Okay? That is what we're saying, the human caused element here. Our emissions are creating this unnatural warming even while we're staying in the groove of warming, cooling, warming, cooling. We're warmer than we've ever been. Okay. This is another graph that we can look at if we're thinking about, okay, if humans are causing it through something like CO2 emissions, who are the biggest culprits? So here again, you can see how this graph maps really nicely onto the one that I just put up there. And so you can see the different groupings of people and the who is the largest emitter here. So overwhelmingly, it's the US. It's us. The US overwhelmingly corners the market and has for a long time in CO2 emissions. We alone count for about a quarter of CO2 emissions polluting the atmosphere. Okay. So yes, China has grown. You can see overwhelming, drastic increase in CO2 emissions in China as they have fully entered their stage of industrial revolution. But we have been more consistently larger and emitting for a much longer period of time. Okay. So we're going to pause here because when we talk about climate change, one of the challenges is that this is a very heavily politicized issue in this country in particular, where there's a challenge of a lot of people argue that there is no consensus, right? There's no consensus about climate change. There's as many climate change deniers as there are people that agree that climate change is a thing, okay? I want us to pause here and watch a couple videos about this, particularly since this is a university, this is a science class, it's a social science class, but we are in the sciences. The first video, video number 1, is looking at how much consensus is there in this climate change debate, and what do we mean by consensus. So it's about 5.5 minutes long. I've linked it down below. You can also see it on the module page. The other video then dovetails really nicely with it, and it's a shorter clip. It's actually a comedy. It's a comedy sketch from Last Week Tonight, which is by John Oliver. And so it's again about the climate change consensus and like, is there consensus? And he brings on a guest speaker and it's funny. So we'll pause there, watch those 2 videos, and then we'll come back together and talk a little bit more about how our state's addressing both the issue of pollution and this particular issue of climate change. So hopefully you watched those 2 videos and you found them to be interesting. Hopefully the John Oliver one was funny, right? But the idea here is that not only within the scientific community, but in most states around the world, most IOs, most NGOs, this issue is settled. The issue is settled, the science is settled, that this is a real thing and that we should be attempting to address it. So with that in mind, what do we do? That brings us to the next slide here where we're talking about risk and uncertainty. So this is where the challenge really comes in. So when we're looking at a lot of this stuff that's going on in terms of the debate, what debate are we actually having as climate scientists, as researchers that are working on this issue? The debate comes in when we're dealing specifically with this issue of what to do about it. So there's no debate that it's happening. The debate is what to do about it. And this is where risk and uncertainty come in. So the entirety of the scholarship framed around climate change in particular and mitigating and adapting to climate change is focused on future projections, right? And so that can be a really hard science to be in because it opens you up to so much doubt, right? This is just projections. It's your opinion based on statistical modeling. And maybe if you model it like this, it could look a little different, right? So organizations like the UN, like the European Union, they operate using what we call the precautionary principle. The precautionary principle is a policy that emphasizes risk avoidance, even when the science predicting it is uncertain. All right, so this is what we're talking about when we're saying there is consensus within the sciences that climate change is real, that these are the areas where we're going to see devastating effects of climate change. So not only sea level rising, limited growing seasons, etc. So a lot of IOs and NGOs and many states associated with them are operating under this principle of we must act as if the risk is exactly what they're saying it is, even if it turns out the risk is not as high as we thought, right? We have to use precaution. The US in particular does not use that model. We use a model that is a bottom line model. It's much more of a market focused model that is saying, what is the least amount I can do to not hurt my bottom line while still doing something to mitigate this in case it is real. I'm not going to say it's real because the uncertainty factor here, I'm not going to lose money if I don't have to. So what's the least I can do to still get the product that I'm wanting and not hurt the environment maybe as much as I was hurting it before, okay? So it's 2 very, very different ways of thinking about how to handle risk and uncertainty. On the one hand, people saying, act as if it's real. And on the other hand, people saying, why would I do that if it hurts my bottom line? So we're going to go through 2 policy options for these two issues each. So the two issues we're going to look at are pollution and climate change. And we're going to look at what are some of the policy options that states are pursuing to address these issues. All right. So in the case of pollution, the first one we'll talk about is command and control policies. So these were very popular starting in the 1970s. These were based on risk assessments that were done, but they proved very difficult to enforce and very expensive. And what these command and control policies did was essentially said the government would come in and directly regulate the specific amount of pollution each polluting entity was allowed. And if you went over that amount, you were fined, you could be shut down, right? You were not allowed to do it. The government could come in and say, cease and desist. You're done because you have reached your polluting limit, right? That is really devastating. And it's really expensive, not only for the government to be trying to enforce, but for companies to be trying to enforce. The second one then, in terms of pollution and ways states are trying to address this market failure, is what we call the cap and trade system. Cap and trade. So this is market-based. It's a pollution control system in which the government sets an overall limit, so like a limit for the country on how much pollutant is acceptable. And then what they do is they issue vouchers to companies that equal their pollutant level ability, right? And then what companies can do, very much like kind of like trade, like baseball trading cards, you can trade them with other companies. So you might have a stack of vouchers like this, and another company could have a stack of vouchers like this. So once they reach their cap, they're done. And your cap is way up here. You can still result in having these companies that are very high polluters. If they can get the vouchers, they get that cap that's much higher. And so they can just be flooding a river system, flooding a local environment with pollutants, but they've got the vouchers, so they're covered. So the last one we'll end here with policy options for particularly addressing climate change. As I said, international organizations, NGOs, and most states are treating this as if it's very real and if it needs to be addressed immediately. So the two policies here central to adapting to climate change are number one, mitigation, and number two, adaptation. All right. So mitigation is reducing the cause of the problem. And in this case, the big culprit is greenhouse gas emissions, greenhouse gas productions. So that has been the central focus of most international climate change accords, is this issue of mitigation, reducing the cause of the problem. So in 1992, you had the UN creating the FCCC, the Framework Convention on Climate Change. The Kyoto Protocol in 1997 was passed as a measure, a very global measure on reducing mitigation, largely using this cap and trade system that we talked about. The Paris Agreement in 2015 was the newest iteration of the Kyoto Protocol. But again, because of these challenges I mentioned in the other couple slides ago, we're talking about risk and uncertainty. There have been lots of challenges with implementation of these different protocols, rooted in the fact that you have countries like the US, like China, that are preferring a market-based risk assessment where they're saying, I am not going to hurt my bottom line. I am not going to stop what I'm doing, especially if I don't see you stopping what you're doing at the rate that I'm stopping what I'm doing. Why would I hurt my economy if your economy is not getting hurt too? I'm not stopping. This is stupid. Okay? So it's been a really big challenge of holding states accountable, keeping states involved. So we know in particular, like with the case of the US, we did not join the Kyoto Protocol, the Paris Agreement we joined, and then we pulled back out of it. Okay? The second one then, adaptation. This is crafting policies to adapt to climate change. So it's the idea of no matter how much we mitigate climate change, we are still already feeling effects of and will continue to feel effects of the climate changing. And so we have to also, at the same time we're trying to mitigate, we have to adapt to the eventuality of some of this hitting us. Okay? So some of the things that are being done, in particular things like building seawalls to try and protect regions of the world that are going to feel the effects of rising sea levels, okay? Building seawalls, refortifying seawalls that are maybe older and in need of repair. Farmers switching crops is an interesting one. An interesting thing that was happening with a lot of my friends that were farmers in Malawi is they had been multi-generational maize farmers, okay? So they're growing corn, maize crops, multi-generation, but they are already feeling not only the effects of climate change, but the effects of environmental degradation due to things like deforestation, desertification, okay, poor irrigation. So all of this combined has meant that they've had to get more creative. So a lot of my friends were actually transitioning from maize to doing things like groundnuts, like soya, right, soybeans, so that they're just fundamentally different. They're able to grow in different environments. They need different things from the soil. Their growing times are different. And so they're actually having a lot of success of transitioning away from, in some cases it was tobacco farmers, other cases it's maize farmers, of we've got to try something else. And we can maybe even get 2 rounds of harvest on one of these crops, one of these new crops, compared to the 1 round of harvest we had with a tobacco crop, okay? So you're having to get creative. You have to adapt. The other one that we can mention that's a little bit scarier and a little bit more kind of feels almost like post-apocalyptic or something is the fact that around the world, in particular island nations, are already having conversations about where should we go? Where should we relocate en masse? Entire populations of nations shifting away from the islands where they lived and thinking, where do we go now? Because in the case of a lot of these particular like South Pacific island nations, the sea levels rising will result in many of the atolls being submerged. Okay, they're hardly sitting above the seawater anyway. So island nations in particular are facing this challenge of we will need to adapt to a climate change by leaving where we live. So if you have any questions, any comments, please link down below, comment down below, email me. Otherwise, this is the very last, it's the, tier, it's the last lecture of the semester. We'll meet one more time to do our little Zoom session. There'll be no lecture, it's just Q&A, and then we'll have our final. So this is the last lecture. I want to thank you guys for being such a great class this semester. You guys have been awesome. We had really good conversations when we were in class, and I appreciate your ability to transition with me and your patience with me as we've transitioned into online. If you have any questions moving forward, please let me know. I'll be happy to be in touch with you. You can always come by my office hours, and I hope to see some of you in some of my future classes. Oh, I forgot to mention that. I did it in my other video. Since this is an intro class, I want to tell you I am teaching 3 classes in the fall. I'm teaching 2 that are in the IR track and 1 that's in comparative politics. So the comparative politics class is sub-Saharan African politics. It counts as foreign culture credit. I'm also teaching 2 elective classes in IR. So the one is global issues in contemporary politics. That kind of is like a hybrid of an intro to IR class with a current events class. So it's pretty cool. We do a little bit of IR in the beginning, and then it's just global issue, global issue, global issue, and we just do all these shallow dives into a lot of global issues. I bring in some guest speakers, things like that. And then the new one this semester, it's the first time the department's offering it, because it's the first time I'm here to teach it, is politics of peace and conflict. So if you are interested in these particular topics of peace and conflict that we've been studying a lot this semester, we're going to be doing much deeper dives into that all semester, from the individual level up to the conduct of nations, looking at both peace and conflict. Okay, so if you're interested in any of those classes, I encourage you to sign up for them. You can ask me questions about it, and otherwise I'll hopefully see you guys around. Okay, have a great day, have a great summer, all the best.